They're really adult stories. They're the stories that point out the Hebrew people and their interaction with God as they understood him at the time, and how they dealt with all of the human issues that human beings still yet today deal with. How they dealt with their own personal issues, with issues within their families, societal issues, political issues, emotional and spiritual issues, all of the things that we as individuals and as a society deal with yet today, they were dealing with in antiquity in those days. And so it is the story of how they dealt with those things and how they sought out God and tried to understand how God would have them to live and the way God interacted with them. That's what we see in these stories. And so we look for ourselves in the pages of these stories and the wisdom that's laid out there. And so we've gone through a number of these stories. Last week we did have one from the New Testament. This week we're going to go back to the Old Testament, a long way back, all the way into the book of Numbers. And the passage I'm going to read to you today is the one that talks about when the Israelites were getting ready to go into the land of Canaan that God had promised them. And some of you may remember this story. God said, I want you to go check out the land. And so Moses decided to send, we call them the 12 spies. You know, they weren't actually called that in Scripture. But they sent the 12 spies into the land of Canaan to check out the land of Canaan and to come back and to give a report. So I want to start there. That can be found in Numbers, the 13th chapter, and I'm going to start with the first verse. And so look at what it says there. It says, the Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe send one of its leaders. So at the Lord's command, Moses sent them out from the desert of Paran. All of them were leaders of the Israelites. I'm going to skip down to verse 7. It says, Moses sent them to explore Canaan. He said, go up through the Negev and on into the hill country. In verse, I think it's 18, it jumps down a little bit. I'm jumping down to verse 18 now. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruits of the land. So here Moses is sending these 12 guys into the land of Canaan. This is the land that they understood God had said to their ancestor Moses, I am giving you a land that is flowing with milk and honey, as God put it. This is the land that I'm taking you to, and it will be your inheritance for your descendants. And so here it was. They were there now, after being in slavery in Egypt for centuries, and finally God delivered them out of Egypt, and they came out of Egypt. He split the Red Sea for them, and they went through the Red Sea, and now here they are at the land of Canaan, and Moses says, I want you to go check it out. And so these guys, they go in to check it out. Now let me say to you that right here, that there is a pivotal point taking place in the minds of the Hebrew people and in the minds of those 12 guys that were sent. In the mind of Moses, there is a pivotal thing taking place in their mind and in the psychology of what they're thinking. Because whenever we go to gather information, there can be two reasons that we're gathering that information. The one reason is that we're gathering information in order to decide whether or not to take a course of action, whether or not to take up some challenge. The other reason we can be going to gather information is that we are simply preparing to take on the challenge, whatever it is. Do you see the subtle difference in thinking there? One is a decision, am I going to do this? I'm gathering this information because I want to decide whether or not this is too hard or it's worth it. I want to make that decision, and so I'm gathering information for that purpose. The other is one that says, I am gathering information because I'm going to take on this challenge, period. That's the only reason I'm gathering the information. I am taking on this challenge, period. Those are the two reasons we would gather information in that kind of way. And that's what's taking place right here now. So the question is what should be going on in the minds of these spies? What should be going on in the minds of the Hebrew people as they are sent out to gather this information? Well, what I've talked to you about in the past when it comes to faith, okay, that in going in faith, what they should have had was the latter that I described. They should have been going in there saying, we are going in to gather information solely for the purpose of seeing how to take up this challenge. It's not a question of whether or not we're going to take it up. We're going to take this challenge. And the only question is how we're going to do it. We're strategizing about how to take on this challenge. That should have been the only thing going on in their minds. But as we'll read later, that's not what was going on. It was the former that was going on. They were going in there, whether they knew it or not, with the mindset of whether we should do it or not. And let me say to you that is something that can take place in our minds before we even know it. And what I also want to say to you is that as a Christian, there are things in your life and there are principles and values that you're called to live by that you need to come to a place that you've already decided, I am going to live this way. I am going to choose this course of action. I'm going to live by these principles no matter what the challenge is. And when I'm gathering information, I'm only doing so that I can strategize about how to take up this challenge, how to do it better. And so there are things that we don't even ask the question about whether or not we're going to do it. So you don't ask the question whether or not, once you're married, whether or not I'm going to take up the challenge of being the best possible husband or wife I can be. That's not something you even ask. That is a challenge that you take up. And if you gather information or you read books or you go to seminars on the subject, you're not going to gather information about whether or not you're going to decide to be the best husband or wife you can be. You're going under the principle, I am going to take up that challenge, period. You don't decide, you don't gather information, you don't read books on parenting to decide whether or not you're actually going to be the best possible parent you can be, or whether that's too much work. You read the book because you've already decided on principle, no matter what the challenge is, that the right thing to do is to be the very best parent that you can be. And there are many other things like that in life. And when it comes to the things that God would call us to, those are the things that we decide on principle that we are going to do and take up the challenge of doing, regardless of how difficult that challenge seems to be. But what happens to us is that when we start gathering information, it is so easy to slip right into the mindset of whether or not I'm going to do this. We think of the principle or the value as something that is an option, something that is a choice. And it's not really. Not according to God's principles anyway, not according to the values we say that we want to live by. Yes, great idea to gather information. And by the way, I'm not saying that, yes, there are lots of things in life, probably most things in life, are open to your discretion. I mean, of course, yes, there are many things that you should investigate before you decide to just go ahead and jump in and do it. You should investigate whether it's worth doing or not. That's wisdom. As a matter of fact, there is another side, there is an other end of this spectrum. And this definitely applies to Christians, where the Christians will decide to do something because they think God told them to. They really just kind of made that up in their mind. And then they go and they jump into something that they want to be true, and they haven't really investigated it. There is another side to this story. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't investigate things. I'm not saying that there are not times to gather information for the purposes of making a decision about what course of action to take. I'm not saying that. There are many times that are like that. But there are also times that we live and stand on principle. We live and stand on values. And when it comes to those times, is it okay to investigate the course of action we're going to take? Yes, but only in as much as we are investigating it because we are determined to take up that challenge. And the moment that you allow yourself to fall into the thinking that says, I'm doing this to decide whether or not to take up this challenge, here's what will happen. You'll decide it's too hard. That's what will happen. Let me read to you what the spies came back and said. So here it says, And this, I'm jumping down to verse 26. It says, the spies, so it says, they came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. There is fruit, but the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites and Jebusites and Amorites live in the hill country. And the Canaanites live near the sea along the Jordan. By the way, that's what they're referencing there. They're describing the fact that they would be surrounded by these other people who would probably end up being their enemies. It says, then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land. For we can certainly do it. We can do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack these people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, and the descendants of Anak from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. In other words, what these guys are saying was, look, man, these guys are huge. These people are big. They have fortified cities that are more powerful than we are. They're stronger than we are. And we just can't take this. We can't do it. We can't take that land. And let me say to you that the very notion of being the servant of an all-powerful God who asks you to live under a calling, when he says, I want you to be my servant and my child, and I want you to live in a certain way, and I want you to take certain courses of action, do you understand that it would only stand to reason that from our perspective, that should look hard. It should look impossible. And the reason is that God would never call us to do something that would not require his help to do it. Because you see, the whole thing is about relationship anyway. The whole thing is about God saying, I want you to be in relationship with me. And so you and I are going to go on a journey together. And I'm going to ask you to do things that require you having faith in me to accomplish it, which means that you wouldn't be able to do it on your own. And if you have to have faith in an all-powerful creator of the universe to do it, then certainly I'm going to bring you to crossroads in your life where it looks like to live on the principle that I've asked you to live on is going to be impossible for you. Or that it's not going to work out for you. And so by the very nature of saying, well, I'm going to gather information, I'm going to investigate whether or not to live according to this principle, based on the information that I have discovered, the only possible conclusion you could come to is that it's impossible and that you're not going to do it. And that's exactly what happened right here to the 12 spies. They came back, they had gone in with the understanding of, oh, we got to decide whether we can do this on our own. And so it's not a matter of we're going to do it on principle because we have faith in God. It is we're going to investigate whether or not we can do it and whether or not we can do it on our own. So in other words, they didn't really have the faith of their ancestor Abraham. They didn't really believe that God had given them the land. They didn't really believe that. That's what it came down to. Yeah, they said, hey, you know what? Great land. You weren't kidding. Yes. We recognize it's flowing with milk and honey. We see that. Wow. But we can't take it. Even though you were right about this, we don't know how you were right about that, but you were right, but we can't take it. We can't take the land, which is another interesting thing because God usually does give you some indication that you can trust him. You know, how did they know that the land would be flowing with milk and honey? But, you know, that was the case. That's what was prophesied, and sure enough, that's what it was. But that didn't convince them. That didn't convince them. And so whenever you're going to live according to principles, if you haven't decided that those principles are something that you live by, you take up that challenge no matter what. If you haven't decided that in your mind, then what will happen is that you will always decide against it. One of the things that is interesting among people in recovery, I've told you we work with 12-step people all the time, alcoholics and addicts. And the 12-step program is a wonderful program. But one of the things that you can easily see in a lot of these people, and it's an indicator of whether or not they're going to fail or not, if they're walking in to the first time to an AA meeting or an NA meeting, and they're there because someone has pressured them to be there, or they're there because the court has sent them there, or they're there for one of those kinds of reasons, and they're there, and they'll even say it, they're there to check this out. They have figured out that they got a problem with drinking. They figured that out. Okay, so I'm here to check it out. In other words, I'm here to decide whether or not I want to do this. Let me ask you, how many of them you think decide, oh yeah, this is for me? None of them. None of them decide that. Not one. They don't. You know why? Because it looks impossible. It looks too hard. The sacrifices are too great. And we are still questioning principles. You'll never have the wisdom to recognize what you ought to do in those situations. The very fact that you're questioning the principle indicates that you won't have the wisdom to make the right decision. They never decide that. And that's why in the first step, it says, the first step of the 12 steps of AA and NA, it says, we came to recognize that we were powerless over alcohol or drugs and that our lives had become unmanageable. I like to change that a little bit and say we came to recognize that we were powerless over alcohol and drugs and that our lives had become unbearable. Because for many of them, that's what it will take. They're okay with unmanageable, not paying my rent, the electric gets turned off. I can live with that. As long as I have my booze, okay, well, the electric got shut off. I can live with that. They can live with unmanageable. It has to get unbearable. It has to get unbearable. And let me say to you that whenever we make this decision to not live according to principles, whenever we decide that we're going to check it out, we're going to gather information about whether or not to live that way, we're always making the decision that in the long run is harmful. We're always making the decision that wisdom would point out it is the most foolish decision that you could possibly make because there's really no other choice. In those 12 steps programs, one of the things that they say is, here's your future. Here is your future. Institutions, jails, and death. That's your future. No question about that. So there is no alternative. Once I listened to a therapist who had a talk show. This was years ago. And I heard a guy call in once, and he started talking about the relationships he'd been in. And he said that, he'd been in a number of relationships where he'd been burnt, where the young lady had, cheated on him or whatever, or left him, and he had put everything he had to him. And this was like, the third time in a decade that he had been in a semi-long-term relationship, and the girl ended up doing something, leaving him or cheating on him, whatever. And he said, I'm giving up. I'm giving up on relationships. I'll never forget the analogy that this therapist drew. He said, let me ask you something. He said, if you were living in a city, in a crowded city, and it was quarantined, it's off in blocks, like Manhattan or whatever. And he said every time you stepped out into the street, you got run over by a speeding fire engine, and somehow you survived. You survived, but you were injured and you were really hurt, and it took a long time to recover. But man, oh man, you finally recovered. The next time you tried to cross the street, got hit by another speeding fire engine. And somehow again you survived, and and it just 3 times in a row. You tried to cross the street, got hit by a speeding fire engine. He said, let me ask you something. Would you decide to quit crossing streets? And the guy started thinking about that. He said, well, he was kind of, he could seem like such an odd analogy. And then the therapist, as ridiculous as the analogy is, he said, look, of course you wouldn't decide to stop crossing streets. I mean, you could, but if you did that, you'd be stuck on one block the rest of your life. And nothing would be as bad as that. The analogy that he was drawing, the metaphor that he was making, is that there are some choices that to decide not to do it would be worse than anything. You understand that the decision for the Israelites then to not go into Canaan, what was the alternative? The alternative was to live their lives in the desert. That was the alternative. And this is before, God started sending the manna from it. So that looked like a death sentence. That looked like starving to death and dying of thirst in the desert. That's what that would have looked like. And so the decision, we can't go into the land of Canaan. Well, the decision is, okay, then I'll die in the desert. Of course that's a foolish decision. Of course it is. The decision for people in 12-step programs, I'm dying, I'm drinking myself to death, I'm losing all of my relationships, my children don't want to be with me anymore, my wife doesn't want to be with me anymore, my friends don't want to be with me anymore, I've lost my job, and on it goes, but I'm still deciding whether or not to make this decision to stop drinking. There is no other decision to make. Principles are principles for a reason. Values are values for a reason. You do them regardless of what the challenges are, because to not do them is death. That's the only other option. And what I would say to you, and what the New Testament, what the Bible, and what our faith teaches us, is that when we live in the way that God has called us to live, there's not an option. There's not a choice. It's not something that we gather information on so that we can decide whether or not to do it. If we gather information, it is for the purposes of meeting the challenge. And I would simply ask you to make the decision in your mind, in your psychology, not to allow yourself to slip into that different kind of thinking. Decide today, what are the principles that you live by? What are the values that you live by? And those things you live by and you stand on in principle, you do them regardless of the challenge. Period. That is a decision that we all have to make when we decide that we're going to live for God. And I hope that we all have the courage to make the right ones. Pray with me. Heavenly Father, Lord, help us to understand that as your servants and your children, Lord, that you have prescribed for us